It feels like it's been so much longer, but 6 months ago, Matthias Klump opened Add XDG top-level icon to allow Windows to set dedicated icons. This was a Wayland protocol. This is a Wayland protocol to allow child Windows to set a different icon from the parent. In the case of LibrePCB, we have this main window here, and then windows that spawn off of that window need to be able to set a different icon. And in some applications, when you have a settings window, the settings window is going to have a different icon from the main window of the application itself. Now, when you cannot load these icons, what you're going to see is all of these sub-windows have the same icon as the main window. This isn't a major deal, right? Like, you can use the application like this, but in the case of LibrePCB here, it provides additional context on what those windows are. Now, what about the cases where you're not actually setting a window icon through a desktop entry file? Because this is the main way the icons get set, and there are some applications like an app image or a Python script or a matplotlib window which are running in a virtual environment which do not have the ability to create a desktop entry file. In the case of an app image, you want them to be portable, and in some cases you don't want to make modifications to the main system. In these cases, those windows just don't have the application icon whatsoever, and it's replaced with a Wayland W. Now, at this stage, it has its reviews. It has its 3 or more implementations and 3 or more acknowledgements. And you might notice this right here. This protocol, as of about 2 weeks ago, this says a week ago, but GitLab is drunk, it's 12 days ago, this actually got merged. So you might notice this bar right here. There was a bit of trial and tribulation to get it merged. So let's go through that. Now, I'm obviously not going to cover every single comment, but I will leave the thread linked in the description down below. Now, first important point, this protocol was never intended for every kind of compositor. Some compositors just don't show window icons, or if they do show window icons, there's something like GNOME, which do things through client-side decorations, and if you're doing client-side decorations, you can just show whatever you want. It's just not at all relevant to have a protocol to pass these icons around. Now, the protocol went through a bunch of different iterations, but by the end, it became a fairly straightforward protocol. By default, all client/sub windows will get the application icon. So if you have main window, and this has an icon that looks like a chicken, then you make a sub window, that will also get the chicken icon, the sub window again will get the chicken icon, so on and so forth. But a client may request an icon from the icon theme. If the icon is not in the theme, it can then decide to send pixel icon data to the compositor instead. The client will then request to set the icon to the icon size provided, and then the icon gets set. Pretty easy. Now, prior to starting this merge request, Matthias hadn't reached out to the desktop environments to see if this is something they would actually want to use. So the point of the merge request was to gauge interest and just work out if a Wayland implementation was going to happen, what it would need to look like. I think it's a minor issue in Wayland, all things considered, but it's often the minor things that make or break the experience for some users. Now, the first person with concerns here is none other than Pro Bono, the developer of App Image and the person you may know as the creator of Wayland Breaks Everything. Now, his concern was regarding the use of desktop entry files, which are the standard way of setting an icon for a window. He thought that you would still need desktop entry files there, which isn't going to be suitable in every single situation. Now, that's not actually the case, but if there is a desktop entry file available, it is going to be used as a fallback. So that pretty much resolved his entire concern. Now, the first actual major concern, which wasn't as easily addressed, was from David Redondo regarding the multi-window apps and the non-multi-window apps, but they have multiple processors. In these cases, wouldn't they just have a static known set of window icons? For these, what would be a disadvantage of just shipping a desktop file for each of the windows? So instead of having this whole new protocol for passing icons around, if they're going to be different windows, just use the existing infrastructure and just set an icon through that means. I have one such application which loads plugins that creates windows with different icons, adding new GUI functionality, so the amount of icons isn't known in advance, but determined at runtime, and the plugins are also added to the same process as the main application. This part makes it pretty difficult, but if they weren't part of the same process, you could theoretically bundle desktop entry files with all of the plugin windows. It's just not how you would typically handle these plugins, and it makes it very, very annoying to actually get them installed. And here we have the most important character to our story, who is going to be very frequently recurring, Sebastian Wick. You can always make up some use case that requires everything to be fully defined by an app. But the question here is, can you solve most issues with specifying alternative icons in desktop files and registering transient apps? And the answer is probably going to be yes. This would, for example, allow the LibrePCB and app image use cases. Now, the issue isn't that you can't solve most of the use cases. The issue is there are edge cases which cannot be solved using this system. In the case of setting it up with desktop files, this would not work for pluggable GUIs where components are loaded dynamically and icons are not known well in advance. When it comes to registering transient apps, that's a lot of work for a tiny thing and won't work for most use cases. And when it comes to LibrePCB and the app image use cases, no, it would likely work for LibrePCB, but not at all for the app image one, unless the latter is permitted to write desktop entry files to persistent storage upon launch all the time. And the whole point of having an app image is that app images are easily portable, and there are a lot of cases where they'll be run on a system where you just don't have write access. Now, early on, most desktop projects were not sold on the protocol, and Simon Sir of the WL Roots project was one of those people. As has already been said in the original issue, so this is actually trying to solve a much older protocol discussion that ended up being dropped. I'll reiterate and recommend that we go for a different solution for the use cases of 1. Running a client with an uninstalled desktop file, and 2. Per top-level custom icons. I don't believe that solving these together is a good idea. The former use case is more than just icons, so he's in favor of solving it, but he doesn't think that this should be bundled together in the same protocol. And as you can tell from the updates, at the time, most people thought the same thing as well. Sway, for instance, doesn't care about the icon. Instead, other clients like bars and panels and switches, which are not implemented as part of the compositor, need to get the icon. This is a very different approach to what something like KDE or GNOME are going to do, where those aspects are a core part of the compositor. In Sway, it's considerably more modular. Instead, he'd prefer to opt for a system where you can dynamically register a desktop file, so even if you are dynamically loading a plugin, it could load a new desktop file as it needs to do so. Now, what I would say to this is, this would make doing window icons incredibly complex, and Wayland is a niche of a niche, so it becomes pretty difficult to force application developers to work with a weird system like that. I feel like a lot of that work would end up just being pushed onto the package maintainers. But yes, if that was the approach that was taken, that would not be suitable as a Wayland protocol. That would be a whole separate discussion. But the problem with dynamic desktop files is, unless you are just generating them and then deleting them straight away, you're still having to persist stuff on your system, which in some cases may just not at all be viable. And here we have another reply from Sebastian Wick. Exactly. The problem that needs solving, focusing on icons, is not solving the actual problem. What we need is a way to transiently register apps without persisting stuff on the system. Maybe that could be done as a dbus service, or maybe even in systemd. We could have an XDG desktop portal to change the global icon, and we could have a Wayland protocol to change the icon of a top level. Translating Wayland terminology into normal people speak, in this context, top level just means window. Now, the problem is this does not solve the core issues. How does this work for individual icons per top level? Windows wanting separate window icons provided by extensions, so no full icon list is known in advance. Also, this wouldn't work for Flatpaks or other sandbox solutions, which now need another way to export the icons so they can be interacting with this system. I don't think this should be in System D, but maybe can be a part of org.freedesktop.application. It feels like making the problem a lot more complex, so I'm not sure if I'd like a design like this, but if it was sufficiently versatile, it would address the underlying issue of this merge request. Sebastian acknowledges that this wouldn't work for Flatpak, but also just doesn't think that would be a problem because it should not be able to change information after setting it up. The entire point here is to make it possible to transiently export the same data that would usually be installed to disk, not to change things at runtime. Why should that be coded into the solution? Why is there no reason you would want to change it at runtime? And then we got this comment. I mean, you're working on something that won't be implemented in a bunch of widespread compositors. You can continue doing that or trying to understand the restrictions you have to work in to make the situation better for everyone. That has aged tremendously well. So well, in fact, that all of the major desktops, minus one of them, have a solution in place. Moving on from that, Brian Tarracone points out the fact the original protocol didn't support icon themes. This was just an oversight, and Matthias went and added it in because it made sense to be there. And David Redondo points out that this protocol probably should be in the XDG namespace. Now, Matthias didn't originally have it in there because XDG does have some stronger requirements to actually be in that namespace, and at this point, it just didn't have that much support from the desktop, so we had it in EXT just because that seemed like a safer thing to do. But after making some updates to the protocol, he did slightly change his mind about that and just put it in XDG just for the time being. If it has to be moved back, it can be moved back. Now, jumping ahead just a little bit through some additional changes and additional update, we get to the first ready point. Now, this is 5 months ago. It only got merged 12 days ago, so you can probably tell that things are not ready just yet. This led to a giant discussion, primarily between Matthias Klump and Xavier Hugel. Other people like Brian Tarracone do throw in some messages here and there, but they both had a lot to say here. Like, really a lot, replying to every single point the other person was saying in their comments, which leads to really, keep in mind, this is a single reply. Really big replies. Really big replies. And later on in the discussion, Brian Tarracone did get a lot more active with replying things, also leaving his own giant essays, which led to Matthias's own giant essays. But at this point, Xavier really was not a fan of the protocol and kind of felt like Matthias was sort of hand-waving away a lot of the complexity as just something that's a lot easier to do than it really is. Saying things like, and no, this decision is up to the desktop environment developers, which includes me and most of the people here telling you this is not a good approach. Matthias says, I am a KDE EV member and a GNOME Foundation member. I am a desktop environment developer, and I'm very much familiar with how things work and what I can and can't change. In this MR, I am mostly using my hat as an application developer, though. That is true. Not just this thread, the entire protocol discussion got incredibly heated. The way that this was going to be addressed was not going to be something that one person came up with. It wasn't going to be something that 2 or 3 people came up with. This was going to be a design by committee situation, and it was going to need a lot of meetings. And here is where things really started to turn. After that thread, a comment from Sebastian Wick, which had absolutely no place being in this repo, which should have been deleted by the mods because this is just trying to start a fight. This is still the wrong way to solve the problem, and I don't think you had to get this into XDG. this doesn't add anything to the discussion. This is basically just saying, this protocol sucks, stop doing it. Like, why is this here? Why did this never get removed? And of course, Matthias replied, you still haven't acknowledged that the problem is real or proposed an alternative for this specific issue though. I have zero interest in solving the issue of creating transient desktop entry files. This MR is just a very focused, single-purpose protocol of giving top-level windows different icons if the client desires to do so, or if no desktop entry is available or installable. And in here we get my very favorite comment, repeating your opinion over and over doesn't make me any more sympathetic to your point of view. Very true. But it also applies in reverse. Now, Sebastian has three main issues. Firstly, XDG already defines how icons are defined. Yes, but this is for application icons, those shown in menus and launchers, not individual windows. These are very different use cases. Icons have to be known statically so they can be checked when an app is submitted to a store where reviewers can then make sure it is not trying to imitate other apps. Yes, but you don't need to review every single window, you just need to review the icon for the application. As long as its launcher icon and store icon are reviewed, which this protocol has nothing to do with, everything is still fine. And not having a desktop file for an application has huge implications beyond a missing icon. Like, sure, we can't debus launch an application, but for these transient executables in virtual environments, that would be an anti-feature anyway. And even for properly installed applications, you may want to have different icons for different windows, like in the case of LibrePCB. And he even goes and brings up the tired old argument of client-side decorations. If you want to show an icon, you can just do it through client-side decorations. I don't know how many times this needs to be said, but GNOME is the only Wayland desktop that doesn't support server-side decorations. Nobody else cares about client-side decorations. All of the others support them, but we need to support this for applications that do server-side decorations, because this is the way it works on every other operating system. This is the way it works on X11. You cannot force application developers who are now working on a niche of a niche of a niche, which is Linux, Wayland, GNOME, to then also redesign their application just for that tiny user base. And everybody else here realizes that. Brian Tarracone here is from the XFCE project. They disable client-side decorations. Neil Gomper here is from KDE. They use client-side decorations if they're available, but they support server-side decorations. And Matthias says, this is not about client-side or server-side decorations. There are Wayland compositors that do client-side, and there are some that do server-side. And if you do client-side, sure, you don't need this, doesn't matter. But for those that do server-side decorations, this is going to solve a problem, which is everybody else. And after not getting his way, he made this thread. You get the same feedback from the two major DEs, and you're not remotely sympathetic to it. I will be ignoring this merge request because the arguments in here have proven pointless, but I'll also make sure this approach gets a knack when it comes down to it. This is twice in the same issue discussion that he's tried to start a fight with people. This time, impersonating GNOME leadership, acting like he has the ability to get a protocol discussion knacked, which he doesn't have at all. I don't know how this comment is still here. And thankfully Matthias is a chill dude, is not going to take the bait, and just not going to deal with the trolling, because frankly, that's what it was at this point. So no need to create an inferior protocol that only solves 40% of the problem just yet. I'd rather polish this one to be as good as possible so it has a fair chance for widespread adoption. Moving on from that, here we have a new face to the discussion, David Go, who amongst other things is quite a big name in game porting to Linux. But in this case, his focus is how this could be used in the SDL library, and how this probably should support existing APIs so that old applications are able to be brought in without really needing to do any sort of excess porting effort, because when we're talking about games, oftentimes they get released, and that's it. They don't have additional support after the fact like most open source software would. Now, Matthias kind of disagrees, thinking that if you don't want to do this porting effort, X-Wayland is probably going to be a better fit then, and we don't want to one-to-one map to the old X11 behavior. Some porting is going to be required because maybe there is a better way to handle these icons than what was being done under the X11 case, which is basically anybody can set an icon whenever they want to. Now, Joshua Ashton of Valve also chimes in with very similar concerns, but this time from the wine perspective rather than the native game perspective. Now, Matthias never expected this protocol was going to get this heated, and reached out to people saying, hey, if you want to talk at FOSSdom, let's talk in person, let's talk things out, and let's try to get this issue actually resolved, because talking through text like this, some people get very, very, very heated and just are not at all productive in the discussion. But then in person, might have a completely different response. Now, considering we're talking about Wayland, one of the issues that was kind of brushed over here is the security aspect. What's to stop an application from switching its icon to pretend to be another application? And Dominic Hayes here has a solution which could work, which is if you are showing the icon, show the new icon that you've set it to as the big green icon here, and then the pink icon as the main window application, or you could show them side by side. Now, this would be a really good idea, and a lot of the people in here are quite in favor of this, but it's also not really part of the protocol discussion because different compositors can choose to make use of the icons how they want to use them. That's up to the way that they do their server-side decorations or show the activity viewer and things like that. It's not something that should be mandated at this level of the stack. Now, moving ahead a bit, we have FOSSdom, and at FOSSdom, he talked it out with people at GNOME, including the one and only Sebastian Wick. And GNOME is showing window icons in exactly one place, the window overview in the GNOME shell. So as far as design elements go, they are not important on GNOME, and GNOME will likely not support this protocol for that reason, which, totally fair, they are allowed to do so. However, they also see no reason to block the inclusion of this protocol for the same reason. Matthias did raise the question of whether or not, because GNOME is basically not going to be involved here, should it still be in the XDG namespace, or should it be moved over to EXT? A voting member, a major desktop, is not going to be using the protocol, so maybe EXT makes more sense and just make it a protocol extension. But it's not a major deal to Matthias, and it doesn't really matter where it ends up. They also had a lot of discussion about how the protocol should work, and this is how we got the drastically simplified protocol that we saw at the start of the video. And like most of the other comments, this started another giant discussion over limits of the protocol, how different things should be handled, whether or not we should allow status information in the protocol. So if you want to show like a +1 on an email client, things like that, whether or not that should be possible. And of course, there is a lot of back and forth and a lot of disagreement, but it seems like it's a relatively productive discussion. And following this, we see some more changes to the protocol, and then finally, a new face from the GNOME project, Matthias Klassen, who brings up some things which he feels are issues. Fair enough. If he was here about 3 months ago, and these hadn't been discussed to death already, and all of these issues had already been resolved. And in a following reply says this: I don't think it makes sense to drag the whole outdated icon theme machinery into Wayland protocols. This is about the fact that GNOME just doesn't have an interest in doing either application theming, because GTK just never supported proper application themes anyway, CSS is not proper theming, but also they don't have an interest in supporting icon themes going forward, and everything they do is going to be Adwaita. But that's not the way the other desktops work. The other desktops are still fully in support of having icon theming. But Matthias Klump, being a reasonable person, is willing to hear him out. Should we drop the icon by stock name part from the protocol? Should we not support icon theming in the protocol? Now, the people that were tagged here didn't respond, but the people who did were like, well, yeah, GNOME doesn't want it, but everybody else does, so no, we shouldn't. And in his comment, David Redondo points out that GNOME is not required to implement the protocol here. If they don't want it in Mutter, they do not have to implement it. But why is it in XDG then? Why not EXT? I think there is a pretty clear expectation that all compositors implement it. And then Matthias Klassen lets himself get one guide by Neil Gomper. If that were the case, then we would have XDG decoration in GNOME, which is the server-side decoration protocol. It would also have cursor shape. It would also have DRM leasing. At this point, most of us in the implementer community expect Mutter to be the outlier, as GNOME has very different opinions of how the Wayland experience should work compared to most other desktops. Now, when I say he got one guide, I mean he made a whole nother thread just to reply to Neil's comment. I don't think it's helpful at all that you keep singling out Mutter and or GNOME and try to mischaracterize them. And please respect that I have my own opinions. I am not a spokesperson for any project, and I don't appreciate being treated like one. Which is fair enough. This then led to a fairly productive discussion where he rephrased the issues he has, and people actually talked them out. They weren't trying to argue with each other, they just discussed the points. And I don't know why this happened, but for a little bit, they got hung up on the term top level. It's an established Wayland term. I don't know why there's an argument in here about that and like why that term should or shouldn't be used, but everybody here is aware of what the term top level means. Going back to that earlier thread, he also got one guide by another person. Now, this happened because someone said, basically the protocol discussion is at the end of the line, things got hashed out at FOSS, we've been bike shedding for months now, just let us move forward, let us actually get this merged. I don't think final hour drive-by concerns are very productive here. And people said, hey, this is not a final hour drive-by concern. Like, things are still being hashed out. Issues are still being resolved. Here we have Victoria Breckenfield from the Smithy project for System 76 saying the way we get good protocols is by actually hearing everyone's opinions and trying to find a consensus, even if the result is we agree to disagree. This is a great comment. Now, moving on from Matthias being one guide, moving through some further updates, some further discussion threads, finally, we see a really, really important change. A preliminary SDL implementation is done. Following this, we see the exact same being done by David Edmondson in Qt and Kwin. Following some more changes to the protocol, and then an official ACK from KDE. Following some more changes, then basically out of nowhere, an ACK from Mer. I don't think I've seen Alan anywhere else in this thread. He just kind of showed up and said, yeah, we're good with it. Now, Simon Sir from WL Roots wanted some very minor changes being done, and then with that change being done, it's reviewed by me and also ACK from WL Roots. And just for good measure, here is an implementation from Gamescope. And with that, it meant something very, very big. What that meant is we now had 3 implementations, Qt, Kwin, SDL, also Gamescope, so there's 4 there, and 3 acts from voting members, KDE, Mer, and WL Roots. After months and months of discussion, 3 weeks ago, this protocol now satisfies all requirements for inclusion. I plan to merge it in a few days. But that's not exactly what happened. From the sidelines, out of nowhere, Sebastian Wick returns. I believe XDG is a place for protocols that have consensus. Well, this is obviously not true, otherwise GNOME would have implemented XDG decorations. There are things in this protocol that do not have consensus and that cannot be undone because of backwards compatibility. And then proposes a whole new protocol discussion. Referring to the main protocol, I don't want GNOME to act this because I believe this community can work together, search for consensus, and is willing to compromise. The other MR exists because we're willing to do this instead of knacking things, but it requires everyone to be ready to talk instead of fighting with each other. Now again, Simon points out that you are not a voting member. Do not pretend to be a voting member. Go and talk to your representative instead. Now, in the new protocol, Joshua Ashton was absolutely sick of dealing with Sebastian and said, if I had any form of membership in Wayland protocols, this would be a 2000% knack from me. And obviously, this is just inflammatory for the sake of being inflammatory. But Sebastian is the one that started it. This doesn't work for SDL, this doesn't work for Qt, it doesn't work for Gamescope, and it doesn't work for Wine. I know you don't care, you've made that clear in the past. Me and others have written and linked as to why stuff like that doesn't work for us before on the real protocol. I'm not going to repeat it here and waste my time. He doesn't have an opinion on the icon theme stuff, but that's because Gamescope is not really relevant to that. Consider this my honorary non-binding, non-member knack. Daniel says, it's clear that your position is immutable. Don't do a back and forth here. And Simon says, please just don't do this. This only heats up debate and doesn't contribute to the discussion. And Matthias Klump, also being sick of this, but also wanted to keep things on track, brings his receipts, goes over every single point in the new protocol and explaining with links to where it was already hashed out, if it had already been hashed out, the things that were being said and why this new protocol just isn't going to work. In the new protocol, Sebastian brings up the fact that icon theming is on this really shaky ground and might not be around in the future, but that's just not true, and will have to support the spec forever. GNOME may stop supporting the spec, especially in-app theming, but everybody else is still fully on board with in-app theming. Nobody else has considered dropping it. KDE, fully on board. WRoots doesn't have an opinion on it. Cosmic, they seem like they support it. XSC, they're going to support it. Budgie, they're going to support it. Nobody else is dropping it. Now, to my surprise, there was some continued discussion here, trying to work out, hey, here's what we can do about the protocol, maybe do this, maybe do that, and all of this went up to about 2 weeks ago, and then just stopped. And there's a good reason it stopped. Simon basically just gave an ultimatum. While I appreciate the positive approach to suggest an alternative protocol, I believe there is no good reason to block this merge request any longer, since as said above, it satisfies all requirements. This merge request represents the best consensus found so far. It took a very long time to find an acceptable compromise. If that consensus is unacceptable to some voting members, they can knack now. I reiterate my intention to merge this protocol soon, and the only comment is from Alan, who we know is in favor of the protocol. Now, there are a couple of last things to address, nothing major, nothing blocking, just fixing things up, cleaning up the protocol, making sure it's in as good of a state as possible to get it merged. There was one other little discussion, also there was a review here by Christopher, one other little discussion, and then finally, a merger by David Edmondson. Whilst the protocol is now merged, that still doesn't mean it is completely done. Following this, Simon Sir opened up a new issue, buffer release semantics are undefined. This wasn't something blocking the protocol, but is probably something going to be addressed in a version 2. Finally, after 6 months of work, this protocol has been merged. The discussion is mostly done, and this can now move forward, and desktops that want to use it can go and implement it. And hopefully application and toolkit developers will start making use of it going forward to make this very minor issue that should not have taken this long to be resolved just be slightly less of an issue. This was a long video. This, I'm looking at my recording time. I've been recording for nearly 3 hours. So, I hope you liked the video. Yeah, let me know your thoughts down below. I am not doing another long one like this for a very long time, so I hope you appreciate it. So, let me know your thoughts down below. If you like the video, go like the video. If you really like the video and you want me to make really long videos like this, please go and support me over here because this is very tiring and I need lots of food to make this happen. So, do that if you like the videos, and I don't know how to end this. Wayland out. I don't know. I'm gonna go to sleep. Actually, it's like 6 o'clock. I'm not gonna go to sleep yet, but I'm gonna make some dinner. Like this.